All right, I suggest we make a start. Welcome everyone to the next in the seminar series from the Strategic Partnership for the Implementation of the Paris Agreement, which is supported by both the European Commission, various funding bodies within Europe, and the Melbourne Climate Futures Initiative of the University of Melbourne. And SPIPA, for those who don't know, is a project aimed at supporting kind of mutual climate action between Europe and a range of countries. There's bilateral agreements or bilateral networking with a whole range of countries around the world that are kind of critical for climate action, and one of them is Australia. And we've been involved for the last few months in building effectively a network for knowledge and action around various aspects of the implementation of the Paris Agreement. For those who don't know me, my name is Brenna. I'm the Australian lead for the project. And we're kind of building up to a big finish with a whole range of seminars towards the end, as we've got the network built and kind of entrained really interesting people active across a range of areas. This week's been the week for cities. For people who were there earlier in the week, hearing Tim talk about particular platforms, techniques for sharing information around cities. And today we've got people who are interested and extremely active in kind of the evolution of the research and action agenda for cities. And we've got two people when we're thinking about the kind of interface between research and action. We've got two people who are perfectly placed to do that, Dr. Brenna Walsh and Dr. Cathy. Brenna has worked kind of exactly at this interface between things like the World Climate Research Program and the kind of international ecosystem of research and the Global Covenant of Mayors and various other kinds of activities, federating activity as well as research around cities. And Cathy has played similar kinds of roles. Cathy has been a local councillor at the City of Melbourne for, I think, 12 years, is currently an Enterprise Fellow, so at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning at the University of Melbourne, so very much interested in the interface between research and activity, and also acted as the knowledge broker for the Clean Air and Urban Landscapes Hub, which was a government-funded activity whose job was really to give relevant, actionable, research-driven advice to various levels of government around Australia. And that was a project that ran for 6 years. So these are a couple of people who've been sitting exactly at this interface. So I'll hand over to them to discuss more the kind of agenda and evolution of activities in this space. At the end, there'll be a Q&A. I'll step back to kind of introduce that. Cathy and Brenna are going to moderate the Q&A themselves. Please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A, and we'll either get you to unmute and voice those questions at the end or read them out. So I'll get off out of the way and hand over to Brenna and Cathy.
Thank you so much, Peter. And thank you to you and Angela for the invitation to speak in this seminar series. We think the project we're going to talk about is of great relevance. And in fact, I first heard about this project at an in-person, not virtual, but an in-person energy and climate college seminar in early 2018, but more on that in a moment. First, Brenna and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we present from. And I would like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and I pay respects to elders, past and present.
And I'd like to acknowledge I'm here in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq people, otherwise known as Halifax, Canada. So I'm coming from the other side of the world from Cathy this evening, which is evening here and morning for her.
It's the way of the world, and the way of this project. It is very much a global project, and we, Brenna and I, both acknowledge, a range of people and authors over many years have been involved in this project around the global research action for cities climate change science. But as you can see on the slide today, we're speaking from the University of Melbourne through the Melbourne Centre for Cities, where I'm based, and Brenna is working alongside me as advisors to the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, or GCoM. We'll say GCoM throughout this presentation, through their Innovate for Cities initiative Yeah, so that's the hat that we're wearing today, but we'll speak to a bit of the evolution of the hats we've worn on the project as well as the project in a moment. Next slide, please, Angela.
So as Cathy mentioned, today we're going to present a bit of the process that was first started to develop the Global Research and Action Agenda for Cities and Climate Change Science. This first came about from the Cities and Climate Change Conference and has evolved into the City Research Agenda. And we're going to then talk about that evolution as we started out in Edmonton, also in Canada, with this Global Research and Action Agenda from this initial conference and moved towards the next follow-on conference, which was held in October 2021, the Innovate for Cities Conference. So the Cities and Climate Change Science Conference was held in Edmonton in 2018, as I mentioned. It was an in-person conference where we brought together more than 700 participants from around the world. And the main goal of this conference was to really bring together different stakeholders from the academic sector, urban practitioners, as well as policymakers to think about the gaps in research relating to cities and climate change, what the really important key topics were for further research, and to kind of move towards thinking about how to think about building this research together with those key communities and other urban stakeholders. So that Global Research and Action Agenda ended up having 6 key topical areas where they identified that research was needed: informality, urban planning and design, built and blue-green infrastructure, sustainable production and consumption, finance, and uncertainty. And we've put together this neat figure that you can see on the slide currently that has those 6 topical areas in the middle section of the slide. Then there was 4 kind of really key cross-cutting issues which cut across a lot of these topics. It's the systems approach, governance and institutions, scale, both being in time and in geographical scales, as well as observation, data, and modeling at the city scale. And so I think that's the good introduction to that, and we'll flip to the next slide.
Yes, so as the title says, we're talking about the evolution from that Edmonton gathering and the knowledge gaps identified and through to the more recent iteration, but the in-between story I think is really important as well in terms of the steps that were taken from this gathering and some of the key outputs. And as I said at the start, the first that I heard of the development of this Global Research Action Agenda was soon after the Edmonton conference at a presentation from one of the Science and Innovation Steering Committee or Science Steering Committee members, Cynthia Rosenzweig. She was presenting in person or as a member of the Urban Climate Change Research Network, or UCERN. And Cynthia was in Melbourne speaking about UCERN's second assessment report. And I was there as a city councillor. I was engaged in cities climate change science policy at the City of Melbourne. And as Peter mentioned, involved in some knowledge translation work as well at the University of Melbourne. And I was especially interested in this distillation of the knowledges gathered in Edmonton of all of these urban climate change actors, and this distillation into this product of this Global Research Action Agenda, essentially talking at that nexus of policy, practice, and research. So I was really interested and really interested in the evolution of that agenda, but I pick up my connection to the project a couple of years later. So I'm going to hand back to Brenna now to talk about how that gathering developed this agenda.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there was 700 different participants that came together for an entire week. So it was a full 5-day conference. And we had really great attendance. I think this was really helped by the fact that the Edmonton mayor and city council were really engaged to attend. They actually gave them the week off to be able to promote them being able to come to the conference. And so we had this really great engagement throughout from the opening plenary to the closing plenary, with lots of questions and discussion throughout all the presentations. And that's really what we had really worked hard to do to get those discussions and ideas flowing. And before we opened the conference, we sent questionnaires out to all the session chairs, asking them to fill in kind of some of these responses, both from their own work and experience, but then from these rich discussions that happened at the conference, to identify those research priority areas that I mentioned previously. Along with the Scientific Steering Committee, put together this research agenda. And so it was presented several times throughout the summer of 2018, and then was finally submitted in the kind of final form to the IPCC in their session in October. And it was hard to get the IPCC terminology right sometimes, but it was noted by the panel, I think, is the official wording. So that was really great progress with that more official report that originated from that conference. But one of the really interesting things that came from that was the Global Covenant of Mayors, who a couple of people attended the conference on their behalf, really saw some interest in this intersection, but also identified some additional gaps and additional stakeholders that they thought were really important to bring into that conversation. And so during the summer of 2018, they actually started to bring more city voices in the private sector together along with that academic and practitioner community to really continue those discussions. And this resulted in the city research agenda emerging as the first project from their newly formed Innovate for Cities initiative, which was inspired by their previous work, but also by this kind of intersection that was brought together at the conference in Edmonton.
We're on to the next slide. The next slide, Angela, it's really just, we have spoken about this Global Covenant of Mayors, or GCoM, and just as a flag for those that may not know, the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy is an international alliance. There's currently, I think, 11,741 cities who are members and part of regional and national covenants that are working together to achieve a climate resilient future. And one of the key features of GCoM is this unified common reporting platform where those cities cumulatively, they've committed to reduce 24 billion tonnes of CO2 by 2030. And we can add the link for their website, as well as links that we're talking to throughout this into the chat. But importantly, the word is the target and the ambition, and clearly research and innovation is a key component of a city's climate action journey. And this Innovate for Cities initiative that was launched, and if you can go to the next slide, Angela, this Innovate for Cities initiative, and Brenna spoke about Innovate for Cities was launched at the end of 2018, and the City Research Agenda is a product stemming from the Global Research Action Agenda from Edmonton, but reinterpreted essentially with input from city leaders that Brenna and others gathered in 2018. And the City Research Agenda, under those 4 questions around why we should take climate action, how we prioritize, what should we do, and how do we finance and scale this action, there are a series of recommendations, research recommendations that come from the Global Research Action Agenda for Cities Climate Change Science. So, and this is critical, for understanding, both sides of the story, from a city leader, from a decision maker, what is the evidence that they need to either be more ambitious or even just to understand where to start. And that's where these initiatives where we're linking science and practice together are really important. And next slide.
So we also want to just take a moment to speak to a couple of the other products that came in within that next year after the Edmonton conference. And so the first one is the Summary for Urban Policymakers. And this was a group of IPCC authors that came together as the 1.5 warming report was being released in 2018, and really synthesized and distilled this with the idea of what this really means for cities and what city policymakers should be looking for to make this report more actionable. And so that's what you can see on the left side of the slide. And then after that, and further publication, 4 cities by cities. A subsequent product, which was led by GCoM, was brought together just to even further synthesize this down and really pull out what was important to cities. I think that in this one, there was even more, there were city leaders brought into the conversation, in addition to those IPCC authors who distilled the summary for urban policymakers. And so that was really even similar to the city research agenda, brought that more actionable, how are we going to get this done, what needs to be done, intentions into this document. That was 2 neat things that also came through as, and are kind of some of the key factors that continue with this Innovate for Cities initiative. And I think we're ready for the next slide. And just one thing that we wanted to let you know about as well, in November of last year of 2021, shortly after the IPCC's first working group report came out for this new cycle, GCoM and other partners announced that the intention to produce further summary for urban policymakers. So those will be produced alongside these new assessments from Working Group 1, 2, and 3. Working Group 1 report, which came out in 2021, and the Working Group 2 and 3 reports, which will come out soon. I believe Working Group 2 is hashing things out as we speak. So hopefully that will come out in full in the next week or 2. And so this is, again, going to be a co-creation process with policymakers and IPCC scientists, and result in this succinct, regionalized, policy action-oriented document from the 3 working groups. So I think that'll be something that'll be really interesting to see come through, and of interest to a lot of the same types of stakeholders that we are working with for this global research and action agenda, and this process as we've pulled this through to the city research agenda.
On to the next slide.
Next slide.
So, we're rapidly going through our evolution conversation of this, and as Brenna spoke to, and I'm sure the audience is well aware, the IPCC is preparing the next round of reports, and as this understanding of the climate science, constantly evolves and is refined, with this in mind, GCoM and partners, in particular co-host UN Habitat, agreed that there was a need to check in with that original global research action agenda on a regular basis, so every 2 or so years, to check in and refine the knowledge gaps and understand where there might be new gaps to be focused on, but also how we're going about implementing and the success in filling the gaps that have been identified. And so last year was the second iteration of that first global gathering, and while we weren't in person, we were online, and we can have a whole conversation about the pros and cons of all of that. But the point of talking about some of the stats and who gathered at this event are important, because this is where we collected the data and the insights for the review that Brenna will go into in a little bit of detail in a moment. So again, the second iteration of this Cities and Climate Change Science Gathering, co-hosted by GCoM and UN Habitat and co-sponsored by the IPCC, was supported once again by a really, a high-level, globally diverse science and innovation steering committee, as well as a partner network organizing committee, acknowledging that these conversations involve a range of actors at that interface of cities and climate change science, as well as a regional curator group with individuals from cities and science in 10 different areas of the world, helping us bring a more regional perspective to the conference. And obviously being online allowed us to bring in a lot more of those perspectives as well. Held last year, and we'll include a link in the chat where you can also relive some of the plenaries and see some of the general information that came from that. But as I keep saying, it was online, and this is where the data was collected, and Brenna will go into some of that in a moment. But where some of the sidebar conversations might have been missed because we're online, where Edmonton, I imagine that the GRAA, or the Global Research Action Agenda, and the idea for this summary for urban policymaker documents, probably came from conversations at the coffee bar in Edmonton, I'm not sure, but certainly there were positives from this larger, more regionally focused event online. And so I'll now just quickly talk to some of the event objectives as well as the stats, just so you again understand where the information that we've gathered to reassess the GRAA has come from. So if you could go to the next slide, Angela, and in doing so, I do want to acknowledge once again that the work for the next section of this presentation absolutely has been driven rapporteurs. So we acknowledge a lot of people have contributed to this work. But essentially, I think we've already spoken about this in terms of the conference. It was an opportunity to bring the practice and science communities together to review the Global Research Action Agenda, an opportunity to update the agenda, but also to feed into COP26 that was immediately following the event, feed into the AR7 assessment cycle, and re-energize the community that was I guess brought together in Edmonton. And as you can see on the outcome slide, the idea is that the new revised Global Research Action Agenda will be presented at the World Urban Forum in June this year. The next slide, Angela, and really the next two slides just talk about some of the numbers and the participation at the conference, again, to where the data is coming from. You can see that we had, almost 7,000 registered participants, and we have data on who attended which events. Because it was all online, people, where some sessions might not have had people attend in person, we certainly can see that people watched the information afterwards. We had people from across the world, from a range of occupations and sectors. Next slide, please, Angela. And the content that we have mined for perspectives and knowledge gaps come from speakers that, again, from across the world and from a range of occupations as well. And the data that is being collected that we will now go into not only came from the presentations and the abstracts submitted, but also the discussion held in each of the sessions. And we had rapporteurs, as Brenna will go into, in each of these sessions. So next slide, and over to Brenna.
Yeah, as Cathy mentioned, we again, for this slightly more complicated virtual event, which had, probably 10 times the number of sessions as we did in Edmonton, as well as 10 times the number of participants. We again invited session presenters to fill in these questionnaires, but then also counted on a really great team of student rapporteurs who were recruited by the University of Melbourne, but came from all around the world, to act as really important note takers to fill in some of those key questions about the research gaps, how these things can move forward and contribute to the COP26 process that came from the conference, as well as other processes and thinking about implementation in cities around the world. So we had inputs from we worked from then these 330 inputs that we got from session chairs and student rapporteurs, as well as discussions throughout the conference with the Science and Innovation Steering Committee, the Partner Network Organizing Committee, and the Global Covenant of Mayors Research and Innovation Technical Working Group during the conference to discuss what they were hearing, how things were going, how things were different from the conversation that we had in Edmonton. And then we also had a few post-conference workshops with that same group to really try and assess what the topics were that were coming through really strongly and where the research needs maybe had shifted, where things had been picked up, where things had been emphasized further or de-emphasized a little, different things that we were seeing through this work. And so if we can go to the next slide. And so the first iteration of the research and action agenda really had a very strong focus, and the bulk of the document was on the specific research gaps. We thought it was really important to pull out some other thoughts that came out of the discussions in this conference that were a little bit different than the ones that we saw in Edmonton. In Edmonton, there was really a conversation about raising ambition in cities. And during the Innovate for Cities 2021, a lot of speakers across many different sessions talked about how we can really catalyze action to close gaps between what the ambition that cities and other levels of government had and actual implementation of solutions on the ground. So one of the first things that we wanted to think about was how we can kind of drive some of these research gaps to be addressed, how to get solutions implemented that follow through with these gaps. And so really wanted to think about this implementation gap. And two things that we thought out were how to sort of change the mindset, thinking about an integrated people-centered vision for the future of cities, and how we can kind of use a lot of the research gaps from that framing, as well as different transformative processes to close the implementation gap. So thinking about diverse local participation and co-creation of solutions, impacts of financing, capacity building, as well as partnerships and how those can work across different sectors and different areas of the world, as well as those research needs and what the impacts of research can be in this area. So that was this key section that we added that we wanted to have as a really important framing before people really dove into the research gaps. So if we can go to the next slide, that is really thinking about, then as I said, we then jumped into the research gaps as we had, which was one of the key things that we saw, the key thing that we saw from this initial global research and action agenda. And then we added a few topics. As you can see here, we have this very similar wheel that we used from the initial research and action agenda, but added a few key cross-cutting issues from topics that had come up as important from in the last 3 years. So we added justice and equity, health, as well as digitalization. And during the conference, we actually identified a further topical area that had really come out strongly, this area of history and cultural heritage that came out through many different discussions. So that was really a really interesting thing that we identified and have added it to, we'll be adding it to our wheel here as one of the important middle circle topical areas. So I can go into a little bit more detail on this in the next slide. And so as I mentioned, we addressed the same 6 topical areas in the original research agenda and then added the history and cultural heritage. So we saw some similarities. I'll just touch on a couple of the topics that here. Saw some similarities in urban planning and design, a lot of discussion about synergies between different solutions, different areas of impact, and thinking about vulnerable communities. That was really consistent through the discussion on research gaps from 2018 to 2021. But there was this additional conversation and additional focus on thinking about historical context in cities and how that had impacted urban planning and design, as well as thinking about mainstreaming that through different urban processes, and with it also inclusive of the city's budget and how that can be really pulled into these processes. Again, one other area to look at, as we mentioned, it was kind of elevated in this conference, was the topic of finance. So we had similar conversations about different financial tools, how to use public budgets most effectively, thinking about innovative ways for public procurement to be used in particular. But there was a different, interesting shift in the conversation about who and how we kind of access finance. Some really interesting conversation about how we kind of, how you can assess the financial needs for adaptation projects. These often the benefits kind of come at different timescales in some ways in mitigation, as well as who can be really impacted and who is able to access finance. So there's a large conversation about the ability for youth actors to access financing and how their prioritization may differ of implementation. So that was a really interesting conversation. And just wanted to also highlight the areas within the history and cultural heritage that came across. So there was a large discussion about cross-disciplinarity, pulling in even further disciplines to this conversation, thinking about architects and historians within both the academic and practitioner space. And really thinking about influences of both participatory planning as well as oral histories throughout how the stories of cities are told and how that can, how we can think about resilience and adaptation to different measures throughout history within those stories. And on to the next slide, please. And again, I just wanted to mention that we added these 3 different areas that came kind of as high importance as the conference in 2021 was being pulled together: justice and equity, health, and digitalization. With health, we found it was interesting. We found a few, upon looking at some of the older research gaps under other topics, that health had come through in several different ones, but now it really was elevated in the conversation, certainly due to the impacts of COVID-19, as well as other areas. And I think that just really interesting as well within the justice and equity topic that we saw this conversation that really also had a lot of synergies with this new topical research area of history and culture, thinking about historical inequities, the culture within planning spaces. And so there's a lot of overlap between those topics, and that conversation was really certainly much elevated compared to how much we heard about these 2 issues in Edmonton. And I think with the next slide, I pass it back to Cathy.
Thank you, Brenna. And I know we raced through a lot of that, and there's still work underway in understanding those gaps. And I look forward to the finished product being launched at the World Urban Forum. But certainly there's a lot of really rich data that is being gathered from the discussions at the conference. And another aspect that's being gathered and being analysed at the moment is, and when we talk about the evolution of the Global Research Action Agenda, there's certainly been a push to, and led a lot from the work from Innovate for Cities and GCoM, is how do the gaps in knowledge or priorities for research differ on a regional basis. And again, I acknowledge my colleague, Dr. Paris Hadfield. She is now at Monash University, but she is part of this review process and is looked at the content of Innovate for Cities conference at a regional scale. And as an example, from the Oceania region, many, particularly Australian presenters, spoke to the need for Indigenous perspectives to be considered in cities' climate action. And Brenna obviously spoke a little bit about that around the cultural theme. And there is an illustration on our slide on the left. It's an illustration from the plenary that Maddie Miller, also from the University of Melbourne, a Darug woman. She's a researcher in the Faculty of Science at the University of Melbourne. And she, in the plenary around informality and equity and ensuring a climate just transition, really spoke strongly about the need to include country when we're speaking about climate action and the equity of knowledges as well. And on the screen, and I think we'll add a link as well, Maddie wrote an article for the University of Melbourne's Pursuit magazine on the future of cities as Indigenous places. And yeah, really highly recommend you have a look at that, that output. Because she obviously articulates it far better than I do. But certainly that is just another thing to look for when we release the updated GRAA. Will be a regional perspective as well. If we go to the next slide, I know we're getting up to our end of our presentation. We've got about 5 or so minutes left. We've raced through, and clearly we've not presented the full detail of the substantive review of the Global Research Action Agenda, but one piece of work that has been released, and you can find it on the Melbourne Centre for Cities website, and again we'll put the link that's on that slide in the chat function, is the report that the student team that Brenna spoke to, the student team pulled together under the guidance from Ariana Dickey, and again, there were 32 students from 17 countries. We're so impressed by this group. Not only did they attend, obviously not all individually, but collectively they attended all of the sessions and worked together to produce a conference report, similar to what I believe happened in Edmonton. And they also looked at overarching themes and what they saw as the key recommendations and findings from a synthesis of their notes. And as you can see on the slide, aligning to what we're seeing through the work that Brenna and Julie are leading, these overarching themes of justice and equity, and a systems approach, and bringing in a much more of an ecosystems lens into that systems approach, were broad themes across the conference, and then specifically around, again, that fine scale, downscale data need, the need to co-produce knowledge, building capacity of small and intermediary cities, increasing collaboration horizontally and vertically, things we all know, but it's good to have it reinforced. Sharing data, open data, that's really important for this equity perspective as well, and as well as enhancing capacity, communicating better and to different audiences, and some of that communication was certainly focused around that finance piece, and to increase access to finance. A lot of that story is around capacity building, not necessarily capacity building around finance, and a more inclusive and intersectional approach to design in cities, in particular around policy. So highly recommend you have a look at that report while you wait for the launch of the revised Global Research Action Agenda, as well as the parallel process that Brenna and I are currently working on with GCoM's technical research and innovation technical working group, an updated city research agenda as well on the back of the updated priorities. So I think that, look at that, I think we're right on time. A couple of minutes to spare, Peter, but we can go to the next slide as our end slide, and happy to receive questions or even comments and suggestions as well. So over to you, Peter.
Beautiful. You are indeed exactly on time. Beautifully crafted. So yeah, what's going to happen from here, as I mentioned at the start, is we'll essentially do a Q&A. People have been either dropping questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll Cathy and Brenna are going to kind of co-curate the Q&A, and you have the choice of either unmuting and reading the question out, or they can read the question out if you prefer to do that. I'm going to open as is taking the host privilege of asking the first question, and interested in developers. It's to do with transport, it's to do with a whole range of things that are strongly mediated in many places through the private sector. How's the buy-in? How's that work? How's the sort of level of cooperation at the more kind of intellectual, thoughtful end of both the policy and the private enterprise space?
It's a very good question, as always, Peter, and it's a question that certainly the Partner Network Organising Committee was in some parts established to fill that gap and that need for, that implement the gaps that have been identified, not only do we need the research to be done on some of the specific questions, but we obviously need partners for implementation. And we certainly have a lot of really positive relationships building between cities and engineers and engineering companies, and how do we build and design our cities without locked in carbon, etc. But certainly it's an area that we need to focus on as part of this implementation process. And some of that, I think, comes in the regionalization work, where at the global level, you can engage in global associations or global networks of engineers or property developers or green building councils, but really that, the implementation happens on a local level, doesn't it? So it's really about making sure we're establishing partnerships with cities and the urban actors around development of buildings and obviously other aspects of city building, making sure that these partnerships become more and more in number, but also in sustainability as well. So yeah, it's certainly a gap and a focus for this next iteration.
Great.
Brenna, if you wanted to follow on at all.
Yeah, I think the one thing I was thinking of, that the really maybe more specific aspect that was a little bit more of a focus relating to that in the conference was discussion on procurement and thinking about how to implement kind of a prioritization of some of these co-benefits that come along with more sustainable projects within the assessment of, how a project gets selected. And so that was a really interesting discussion. And I think a lot of sharing between cities on how that's been put into place has been important, and something that can be continued to be elevated and sharing be facilitated through this process as well. So I think that was an interesting point that came up in so many places in the conversations that I was hearing in the conference.
It's a good point, isn't it? How do developers, landlords, all the kinds of people that owners of capital stock and so on, how do they get to the benefit, to share some of the benefits of actually potential expenditure and effort and so on to go and to make these kind of improvements? And I guess there's a whole lot of strategies around about how to do that, but it's probably a really important point, just given the balance of private ownership of resource in most of these cities. All right, I'll now get out of the way and hand over to the two of you to handle the Q&A, and I'll come back and give a brief wrap up at the end.
Thanks, Peter. And Brenna, I'm going to hand it straight over to you only as an author, but Caroline, I'm not sure if you want to speak to your question. It's very clear on the Q&A, but if you wanted to, I'm not sure, hold on if I can. Put you on off mute, but essentially that you've asked a question around digitalization and the topic, and our colleague Poya from ICLEI World Secretariat, it's music to his ears that you're asking that question. But Brenna, did you want to elaborate on this digitalization topic? And then Caroline, I can unmute you if you'd like, if you raise your hand, if you want to follow up the question.
Yeah, this is a cross-cutting area that we thought was important, that had, I think there was hints of conversation about it in Edmonton 3 years ago, but there's certainly become a lot more of a broader topic of conversation within the city space. And digitalization and smart cities is actually the full title of our topical area, which we invited submissions on. So that was interesting. And so a lot of that conversation came in around different digital tools that could be used, particularly around financing, actually, as well as things like drones being used for different things in cities that may be being able to bring in that additional data, thinking about efficiency, prioritization, crowdsourcing ideas, as well as funding, I think came through pretty strongly in that topic. That was one that came in, and as has been mentioned, Purio will be elaborating on that. He has really done some good work in kind of distilling the information, the real detail that came from those sessions. So interested to see some of that detail as well. we'll have the, additional detail in the update to the research agenda, as Cathy mentioned, but I think he's dove in further, which I think there's, with all the data that came through from this conference, there's a lot of potential to do on a lot of different topics.
Caroline, we've given you speaking permission if you'd like. We don't have another question lined up. So if you wanted to even mention your interest in that topic, but feel free to decline.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for the presentation and for all the work that's obviously gone into all of this. Yeah, no, I didn't. I just have a general interest, I guess, in what's going on in that space. There's so much data floating around, and yeah, there's many different ways that we could be making use of it. So I was sort of, yeah, you've given me the upshot that there's a lot of interesting work going on.
Well, thank you for that. So, Peter, I see you've gone off mute. If you'd like to fill in another question,
I did have. I was kind of interested in. You've talked a lot about the research agenda, which is great. You've also had probably a really good chance watching these conferences, particularly Brenna, probably watching a couple of these evolve, to get a sense of what's the vibe. Are people kind of confident about the way cities can evolve to contribute and respond to climate change? Are they feeling like cities are going to be kind of victims of some dystopian climate disaster future? What's the sense of emergency versus opportunity, if you like, around these conferences at the moment?
I think there's definitely a mix of both of those. It was really interesting to hear the level of detail that I think we were able to get into with some of the presentations, being something like 500 odd presentations through this conference. The ideas and detail examples from particular cities, sharing between other projects that we were able to get into, and thinking about different ways to build partnerships, different ways to think about community participation, and really bringing in all the actors that I think have recognized themselves in this space in which 3 years ago they might not have recognized themselves as much. So I think that's a really neat progression. But one thing that did come up, I think, more strongly in the Innovate for Cities conference in this past year was just the need for recognition of some of the barriers that might also be being faced in cities, which are different in different contexts around the world. And so historical ways that things have kind of played out historically in cities, which have been different again across the world, different barriers in terms of incentives for different actors within the city. And so I think there's also this thinking about how we move forward in a reality that won't be perfect. And I think that's something that's come out strongly, and really starting to be able to think within that space has also been really interesting. Getting things that are considered solutions in place and really mitigating some of those impacts, but also having to live with some of the impacts as well, and thinking about how that will come through. And I think certainly both in Australian and Canadian context, thinking about living with the fires that have started to intensify in the last few years, and how that can be, what we can be doing to change the way we live in cities, to kind of live with some of those climate change impacts that are already here. So it's been an interesting conversation to continue tapping into.
Yeah.
I was going to say, Peter, just to add in, and I know that you'd have lots to add here too, that was really interesting. Obviously, it moved. The Innovate for Cities conference led straight into COP26, and obviously we're now looking forward to the so-called African COP and COP27. And from a city person who's attended many of these climate conferences, but also been involved in these academic conversations about cities, perhaps less so with cities, it is, really positive to see that cities are still stepping up and showing leadership in this space. They're getting a lot more sophisticated about their plans and how they're going to implement, where they've got great ambition, and I think a lot more are working on the using that evidence to really make decisions to get the greatest action to meet their targets. But what has been really positive is the bringing together of adaptation, mitigation, and clearly, you know, as Brenna spoken about, a lot of the cities are not only dealing with the effects of climate change, you know, they're looking to how to make their cities more resilient, and that's really interesting.
That last point really is music to my ears about this trade-off that goes on between adaptation and mitigation all the time. It seems to me to be a very kind of suboptimal way of looking as if these things are kind of either or, when clearly in the city's perspective they're not, right? There's so many cases where it's win-win, and it's really good to make sure that policymakers, people actually who can do things in cities, are aware of that. If there's not another question, I'm going to ask one more, because
there is one.
Excellent.
So if you don't mind,
Do that.
Jordan has put in a question, and I'll just read it out if that's okay, Jordan. But I think you can raise your hand maybe to let us know if you want to follow it up. But the question is, you know, how do you judge for justice and equity, given that justice means different things to different people? And Brenna, you can follow on, but I think that's exactly, you know, your point is absolutely right, Jordan, and that's why this theme of understanding local knowledge and participatory processes in not only the design of research projects, but also in the communication of or translation of that to policy and practice, and that really understanding at a local level, what does justice and equity mean to the different groups within a city. I think more and more of those, and that's where that, you know, not only is it vertical relationships and all governments working together is important, but horizontally in cities, all city actors working together is part of that justice and equity answer. So I'm not sure that sort of answers, but yeah, it's not for me to judge on the whole world, but rather we need to be putting into these research objectives and priorities a lot more of a local flavour of what that means. But Brenna, I don't know if you want to add, and then Jordan, we can unmute you and you can let us know if you want to follow on from that. Brenna, did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I think that there's certainly a recognition that that is something different for many different actors. And I think that we are trying to be as inclusive as possible within that. And it's just really interesting to see, you know, it was identified as a cross-cutting issue before the conference, and interesting to see how that kind of touches into so many of these topical research areas.
And we've got a couple of minutes left, but Jordan, did you want to add to that? And thank you for that paper. I'm not sure what the audience can see, so I'm going to add your paper into the chat as well, just in case they didn't catch it in the Q&A, but thanks for sharing that paper. And I mean, and it's absolutely health and well-being, as you saw, was an issue that's come through much stronger in the latest iteration as well. I can see that Jordan hasn't gone off mute after a request, so I think that I'm probably going to handball back to you, Peter. We've come to the end.
Yep, I think we're probably ready for wrap up. So thanks again, both of you, for working around the peculiarities of time zones. Fantastic, beautiful tag team, really delightfully, wonderfully organized presentation, and clearly a critical agenda. As I think we commented earlier in the week at a previous seminar, cities are responsible for so much of the health and well-being of so much of the population, and so much of the emissions. Even a disproportionate share of drivers of emissions are urban, and increasingly so, that understanding how to make the systems work in a way that responds and reduces climate change is clearly one of the larger global problems we'll face. It's also one of the more complicated, and it's really good to watch the evolution of large-scale, really bottom-up driven action to respond to that. And thanks very much to both of you for giving us a summary of where that sits. Really interested to watch this. I'd actually forgotten about the summary for urban policymakers as a kind of lens on the whole climate change, the body of climate change research, and that's a really good thing to go back and look at. So that brings us to the end of today's seminar, but most assuredly not to the end of the series. In particular, I bring to people's attention that we've got a wrap-up of the whole series of activities that we've been doing around SPIPA that's scheduled for 3 evenings Australian time next week. And in particular, there's the launch of 2 major reports, which are kind of relevant to today's discussion. One of them is about energy poverty and energy affordability and how that's being kind of approached in the climate transition differently in Australia and Europe. And the other is around the drive towards energy efficient buildings. And again, thinking about the regulatory and organisational context that can make that work and the kinds of comparisons between Australia and Europe. So that'll be kind of 2 major foci, but we're also going to bring together the range of things we've been doing in the knowledge network over the last few months. So really invite you to register for those and have a look. And there are other seminars coming up as well before the end of the project, and please keep a look on the website for that. So thanks again to Brenna and Cathy. Thanks to Angela for organising this, and we'll hopefully catch up with you all down the line.
Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much.
Thanks again.